This is the story of what the hump on the Boeing 747 was really for. Most people think the iconic hump was designed for passengers. The truth is, Boeing never intended it to become a luxury feature, because when the 747 was being designed, company executives believed the aircraft might become obsolete within just a few years. The hump exists because Boeing was preparing for a future where passengers would abandon the 747 altogether. Let's rewind. Back in the 1960s, many experts were convinced that supersonic aircraft would take over long-haul travel. Concorde was on the horizon, governments were investing heavily in faster aircraft, and Boeing feared its giant new jumbo jet could quickly become irrelevant. The company needed a backup plan. That backup plan changed the shape of the airplane forever. What started as a practical solution for loading cargo eventually created one of the most recognizable aircraft designs in history. More than 50 years later, people still recognize the hump instantly, even though it was never supposed to be the feature anyone remembered. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the 1960s and understand what was really happening in the aviation industry. Commercial aviation was growing at an incredible pace. Jet aircraft like the Boeing 707 had dramatically reduced travel times, passenger numbers continued rising, and airlines needed larger aircraft to carry more people between major cities around the world. Boeing saw an opportunity. The company set out to build something that had never existed before, an airliner capable of carrying more than twice as many passengers as the 707. The project would eventually become the Boeing 747, an aircraft so large that engineers had to rethink almost everything. Joe Sutter led the program, alongside a team that would later earn the nickname The Incredibles. Their task wasn't simply building a bigger airplane. Wings needed to grow larger, landing gear became far more complex, engines required more power, and Boeing even needed larger manufacturing facilities to build the aircraft. The scale of the project was enormous. Yet, while Boeing was developing the world's largest passenger aircraft, another idea was capturing attention across the aviation industry: supersonic travel. Britain and France were developing Concorde. The Soviet Union was working on the Tu-144. The United States was exploring its own supersonic transport concepts. Throughout the industry, many experts believed that faster-than-sound travel represented the future of aviation. The logic sounded simple. If passengers could cross the Atlantic in 3 or 4 hours instead of 7 or 8, airlines would naturally choose the faster option. Many executives genuinely believed large subsonic aircraft would eventually become outdated. That possibility worried Boeing. The company was investing enormous resources into the 747. If supersonic aircraft dominated international travel, the market for giant passenger jets could shrink dramatically. Boeing needed another role for the aircraft if that future became reality. The answer was cargo. Freight operators cared about different priorities. Speed mattered, but capacity often mattered more. Cargo companies needed aircraft capable of transporting large and unusually shaped freight efficiently. Boeing decided the 747 should be designed with that future in mind. That decision changed everything. One of the biggest challenges in cargo aviation involves loading oversized freight. Traditional aircraft use side cargo doors, which work perfectly well for baggage and standard shipping containers. The problem appears when the cargo becomes exceptionally large. Aircraft engines, industrial machinery, generators, and specialized equipment often create loading challenges because they simply do not fit through conventional openings. Boeing wanted a better solution. Engineers envisioned an aircraft that could load cargo directly through the front. Rather than forcing freight through side doors, the entire nose section would open upward, allowing oversized cargo to move straight into the fuselage. It was a clever idea. The problem was that commercial aircraft traditionally placed the cockpit in the nose. If the nose needed to swing open, the pilots couldn't remain there. And that's where the story of the hump begins. Rather than positioning the cockpit at the front of the airplane, Boeing elevated it above the main deck. The flight crew would sit higher than the passengers, safely out of the way whenever the nose opened for cargo operations. That practical decision created a shape unlike anything else flying. Nobody at Boeing was trying to create an icon. Nobody sat around discussing how the aircraft would look in advertisements decades later. Engineers were simply solving a cargo loading problem. Function came first. As development continued, another opportunity appeared. Moving the cockpit upward created usable space behind the flight deck. Rather than leaving that area empty, Boeing added a small upper deck that airlines could use for passengers. The result surprised everyone. Several airlines transformed the upper deck into one of the most exclusive spaces in commercial aviation. Some installed premium seating, others created lounges where passengers could relax during long flights. The experience felt completely different from the rest of the aircraft. Passengers climbed a spiral staircase and entered a cabin separated from the crowds below. The atmosphere felt quieter, more private, and more exclusive. For many travelers, the upper deck became the most desirable place to sit. What nobody expected was that this famous passenger experience existed only because Boeing thought the aircraft might eventually become a freighter. The irony couldn't be greater. A feature people associated with luxury had actually been created because of cargo. Meanwhile, the future Boeing expected never fully arrived. Concorde entered service and became one of the most recognizable aircraft in history. Its sleek design and incredible speed attracted worldwide attention. Yet, despite the excitement, supersonic travel never became mainstream. Operating costs remained high, routes stayed limited, passenger demand never reached the levels many experts had predicted. The American supersonic transport program never entered service. The Soviet Tu-144 experienced only a brief operational career. The result was exactly the opposite of what many people expected. Instead of becoming obsolete, the Boeing 747 became the backbone of long-haul international travel. Airlines around the world embraced the aircraft. Millions of passengers crossed oceans aboard jumbo jets. The airplane that Boeing expected might need a backup plan suddenly dominated global aviation. Cargo operators benefited as well. Because Boeing had prepared for a cargo future from the very beginning, the 747 possessed capabilities many competing aircraft couldn't match. The raised cockpit and nose-loading design allowed operators to transport unusually large freight with remarkable efficiency. Aircraft engines became one of the best examples. Modern jet engines are enormous. Their size often creates transportation challenges. Yet the 747's nose-loading configuration allowed operators to move these engines more easily than many alternative aircraft. Large industrial equipment followed. Generators, machinery, aerospace components, and specialized cargo regularly found their way aboard 747 freighters. What started as an insurance policy eventually became one of the aircraft's greatest strengths. Years passed and Boeing continued refining the design. The original 747 introduced the world to the jumbo jet. Later versions improved range, efficiency, and passenger capacity. The 747-300 featured a longer upper deck, while the 747-400 became one of the most successful versions ever built. Through every redesign, however, one feature remained. The hump stayed exactly where it was. By that point, it had become inseparable from the aircraft's identity. Travelers recognized it instantly. Airlines featured it prominently in advertisements. Aviation enthusiasts photographed it whenever they had the chance. The silhouette became a symbol. For millions of people around the world, the 747 represented international travel itself. Seeing one parked at a gate often meant a journey across an ocean was about to begin. There was another unexpected consequence of the elevated cockpit. Passengers seated at the very front of the main deck actually occupied a position farther forward than the pilots themselves. Very few commercial aircraft offer that perspective, yet the 747 made it possible because the cockpit sat above the passenger cabin rather than ahead of it. Once again, a cargo-driven design decision created an unexpected passenger benefit. As the decades passed, aviation technology continued advancing. New aircraft entered service with more efficient engines, lighter materials, and sophisticated digital systems. Competition increased. Twin-engine aircraft gradually became capable of flying routes that once required 4 engines. Airlines increasingly favored aircraft such as the Boeing 777, Boeing 787, and Airbus A350 because they offered lower operating costs while serving many of the same routes. The industry was changing. Passenger 747 fleets slowly began disappearing from airline schedules, yet the aircraft's legacy remained secure. Even today, cargo operators continue flying freighter versions because the original design still provides advantages that are difficult to replace. That brings us back to the Hump. Most people see it and assume it was created for passengers. Others believe Boeing designed it simply because it looked impressive. Neither explanation tells the full story. The Hump exists because Boeing wanted a nose door. The nose door existed because Boeing expected the aircraft would eventually become a freighter. The upper deck appeared because moving the cockpit created extra space. One decision led to another, and together, those decisions created one of the most recognizable aircraft designs ever built. Looking back, the entire story feels almost accidental. Boeing expected supersonic travel to reshape aviation. Engineers developed a cargo strategy to protect the company's investment. A practical solution moved the cockpit above the main deck. The empty space behind it became an upper deck. What emerged was something nobody planned. The most famous feature of the Boeing 747 wasn't designed to become famous. More than half a century later, the Hump remains one of aviation's greatest examples of function creating form. It wasn't created to symbolize luxury. It wasn't designed to attract attention. It wasn't intended to become one of the most recognizable shapes in transportation history. It simply solved a problem, and in solving that problem, Boeing accidentally created an icon. The Hump wasn't created to make the 747 famous. The Hump is what made the 747 famous.